Well, I want to welcome you this afternoon or this evening or this morning, depending on where you're logging in from today. RTS New York City is happy to have you. I see many of our students from New York City and also from our other campuses. And we're delighted today to have Dr. Christopher Watkin, who's lecturer in French Studies at Monash University. He's going to be speaking to us as part of our Enrichment Series on developing a biblical critical theory. Here in the US, the whole subject of critical theory has been very much alive in the church and in the culture. And Dr. Watkin has been involved in this area before this became well known among us. One of the reasons we're so pleased to have him is he actually has read critical theorists. And as many Americans are apt to do, to speak about things they don't know anything about. So we're not in that situation with Dr. Watkin today. And for this, we are indeed quite pleased to welcome him. The way this is going to work is he's going to speak for us for 45 minutes. We're going to leave some time for questions at the end. I'm going to adjust the chat to where, or I'm going to ask that you not chat in questions as he speaks. I think that could be distracting for listeners and perhaps for him as well. But at the end, we will receive your questions. And so, Dr. Watkin, thank you for being with us, giving us your time. You're being assigned in our summer Apologetics course. Your book on creation is being assigned, and that was actually unrelated to this particular talk. This appeared on the syllabus, so you're going to be familiar to our students, and just again, very grateful for your time this evening.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much. Can I just check that everybody can hear me? A couple of thumbs up would be wonderful. Thank you, Brandon, Daniel, Rob, Charlie. It's a huge privilege to be here talking about this. It's very much what I'm thinking about right at the moment. And so this is the first opportunity I've had to share these ideas, give them a bit of a test drive. So I'd be really interested to hear what you think about them at the end. It's an important question, I think, that I'm going to be looking at today. And it's actually a question that I've been thinking about for the last 20 years or so. So let me take you way back to 1998, when I went up to Cambridge University to study French and German literature. And within about 2 weeks of arriving there, I found myself buffeted by two very strong crosswinds. One of them was the course that I was studying. And what I found was that in essay after essay, I was being challenged to make sense of how a whole parade of people who were very different to me made sense of the world. So, what drives the medieval knight to serve his lord with such blind faithfulness? Or why is there so much delirious, drunken optimism at the beginning of the Enlightenment? Or why does a certain sort of boredom become fashionable in the mid-19th century? Or why did some avant-garde writers actually welcome the First World War? These sort of questions were thrown at me again and again. And we had classicism, we had Marxism, we had surrealism, we had storm and stress, modernism, existentialism, deconstruction, and movement after movement was challenging me in my own way of making sense of the world. As a Christian, it was wonderful, it was exhilarating. But at the same time, there was another blizzard buffeting me at that time. And it was from my church, because week after week, my church was preaching and teaching a cataract of invigorating truths about Christ and the gospel and a Christian way of looking at the world, helping us students to see things, to see everything from a Christian point of view. And I was being incessantly challenged to think deeply about the faith and about all of life. And it was at this point in my life, among the Christian friends that I had at university, one of whom at least is here listening. Hi, Charlie. That I discovered that the faith is not just a bunch of ideas to believe, but it's a true story of the whole universe. It's a real tale of love, of loss, of promise, of costly rescue, in which we all play a role. And I found myself sort of caught in the crosswinds of these two gales, looking for a way to try and channel them together. The Bible, I thought, it had to have something to say to all these cultural and social questions that I was grappling with in my degree, but I just wasn't sure what it was, how to bring the Bible into conversation with all these ideas. And the material that I want to present today is part of my best effort at providing a response to that question. It's part of a bigger project that I'm working on at the moment. I'm hopefully, God willing, going to bring out a book with Zondervan in 2022, in which I move from Genesis all the way through to Revelation to consider how the Bible's main turning points inform a biblical, critical, and social theory. But as Jay was saying, some of this material in an earlier form has already come out in the book Thinking Through Creation, and there's a little bit more material on the website thinkingthroughthebible.com for anyone who's interested to chase that up. So what I want to try and do in the time that I've got today is 4 things. First of all, I'd like to set out what a critical theory is, and perhaps more importantly than that, what it does and how it does it. Secondly, I'd like to paint a big picture of what we might mean when we talk about a biblical critical theory. Thirdly, I want to give an example of a biblical critical theory in action. And finally, I want to try and end by suggesting why it's important for us to develop this thing that I'm calling a biblical critical theory today. So then, what is critical theory? I think I really need to clarify this, and especially the way in which I'm using the term, because there's an important sense of critical theory that I don't mean today. Critical theory, crash history course, has basically got 2 senses. It's got a broad sense and a narrow sense. And over the past few years, it's the narrow sense that's come to dominate, particularly actually in Christian circles. So the narrow sense is the Frankfurt school of critical theory in the early 20th century, figures like Herbert Marcuse and Antonio Gramsci. And this is loosely what gets called in Christian circles today cultural Marxism. But that's not how I'm using the term today. I'm using the term in its broader sense, and it was the term that I was introduced to as an undergraduate. So of all the units that I took when I was at university, the most exciting one was a unit called Modern Critical Theory. And we spent 1 week on each of the main sort of 20th century luminaries of theoretical thought. We had a week on Derrida, a week on Deleuze, a week on Foucault, and so forth. We only had 1 week on the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, no Marcuse, no Gramsci. Okay, so that's this broader sense of critical theory. It's the sense of critical theory that's used in engagements such as this book here, Cassandra Falk's edited book, Intersections in Christianity and Critical Theory. So there are essays on feminism, queer theory, animal studies, literary criticism, but Marcuse and Gramsci are not even in the index of this book. And this broader sense of critical theory is critical, I think, in 2 ways. First of all, this is a little bit nerdy, but it's quite important. It flies in the slipstream of Immanuel Kant. And for those of you who study philosophy, you'll know that Kant fundamentally changed the way that we do philosophy. There's a BK and AK, before Kant and after Kant. So before Kant, philosophy is full of bold claims about what we can know, about ultimate reality, about God, and about good and evil. And philosophy's task is basically to justify our knowledge. And Kant changes all that. With Kant, philosophy becomes fascinated with the limits of what we can know. And this is what historians of philosophy call critical philosophy, Kantian critical philosophy, where philosophy's main task is not actually to justify our knowledge anymore. It's to critique our knowledge and set limits on it. Another way of putting that would be to say that with Kant, philosophy becomes suspicious of what we think we know. And that's the first sense in which critical theory is critical. It's suspicious of claims to knowledge. And the second sense in which it's critical is that it doesn't just take current social reality at face value. But it's also critical of contemporary society and contemporary life in the name of some standard that challenges the status quo. And critical theory is also critical in that sense. So that's a sense of what critical theory is. But I think the more interesting question is actually, how does it work? What does it do? How does it get its teeth into reality? What sort of moves does it make? And that's what I want to think about now. Think of it in this way. Okay. It's been estimated that the human body sends about 11 million bits of information per second to the brain for processing through our 5 senses. And the conscious mind is actually only able to process about 50 of those bits per second. Now that means that we pay attention to about 1/220,000th of all the information that we receive. That is not a lot. That is not a huge percentage. So our experience of the world is in large measure about the very small number of things that we choose to pay attention to, and the very large number of things that we choose to ignore. And the fraction of the world that we notice is therefore always partial. We never have a full picture present to our consciousness of anything. We always make choices about what to pay attention to. Some things are visible to us, and some things are screened out from what we're aware of. And that's just the way life is. That's just part of being a finite creature. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just the way we live. And the first thing that these critical theories have in common is that they help shape what we pay attention to. That they bring some aspects of the world and some aspects of our experience into the foreground. They make them visible. And necessarily, therefore, they bring other aspects of our experience into the background and make them invisible. Critical theories make some things visible. But they also do something else. They each understand or code some attitudes, some ideas, some actions as good, and other actions as bad or evil. Some types of behavior, some objects in the world are praised and others are condemned. So, in short, critical theories make some things visible and they make some things valuable. Now, in order to press further into this idea, I want to introduce 2 words that I think are going to help structure our discussion. And I think they're also going to help us to overcome some of the misunderstandings and controversies that bubble up in Christian circles about this whole idea of worldview, which is sort of the area that we're moving in with these critical theories. I want to talk about figures and worlds. So first of all, figures. Figures is a term that I want to use to describe the sort of moves that these critical theories make. And there are 2 senses of figures that I think are helpful for us. The first sense comes from rhetoric. We're all familiar with the ideas of figures of speech, like metaphors, all the world's a stage, or alliteration, day doth daily draw my sorrows longer, or simile, thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart, and so on and so on. Now, each figure is a repeatable pattern or structure of language that can be filled with almost any content whatsoever. My soul can be like a star or like a snake or like a sapling or like a stone. It can be like anything. And each figure, therefore, allows for almost infinite variation while remaining distinguishable from other figures of speech. You don't get them confused. And so figures of speech, therefore, are linguistic patterns in space or linguistic rhythms in time. And I want to take this idea of figures of speech and broaden it. So patterns not just of language, but patterns in creation of matter, of ideas, of stories, of systems, of relationships, of behaviors. That's the first sense in which I'm using figures. The second sense comes from the theory of perception. When we see something, when you're looking at your computer screen now, what we perceive can be divided into a figure, which is what we're paying attention to, and the ground or the background, which is what we're not paying attention to, our peripheral vision. And choosing what to pay attention to, choosing what to count as the figure and what to put into the background is always a choice, because again, we get more information visually through our eyes than we're able to process. So we need to make decisions about what's the figure and what's the ground. So for example, in this lovely poster, we need to decide, is this a picture of Batman on a yellow background, or is it a picture of the penguin on a black background? It's very hard to see it as both at the same time. So then figures are repeatable patterns and rhythms that make selections among all the things that we could notice and all the things that we could value. And I think there are more or less 5 broad categories of these figures. The first one is language. So we're thinking here about the ideas and stories, words, concepts, symbols, and narratives that we use to experience and to create patterns in our lives and in our thoughts. Let me just give a couple of examples. We've got things like the baggage that we pack today into words like success or beauty, or the cultural baggage in phrases like boys will be boys, or no pain, no gain, or in societies, one remaining myth of heroism, of the valiant individual forging her own authentic identity in the face of a society that would wish to oppress her. So that's figures of language. We've also got figures of time and space. The way that we rhythm time is a series of figures. So for example, today's 24/7 society is a way of shaping and patterning time. Or the ideology of historical progress, that things over time get better. That's a figure. We might also think of modern Western ideas of personal, private, and public space as a way of rhythm in space. Or think of the way that over history we've thought of wilderness spaces differently. Are wilderness spaces there to be colonized, or are they there to be conserved and protected? Those are different ways of figuring space. Then we've got a category that I call the structure of reality. So for example, whether we think along with Western modernity, that we live in what Charles Taylor has called an immanent frame, in which there's nothing beyond this world that we see and touch, or whether we actually think there's an afterlife or perhaps reincarnation. Those are all ways of figuring the structure of reality. And then there's behavior. Culture is expressed, it's shaped by our bodily habits. What some have called the liturgies of our lives, like going to the mall or checking our phone when we've got a spare moment, or sitting down to eat rather than lying down to eat. Some of these behavioral figures are individual, and some of them are shared among communities. And finally, we've got figures of relationships. We pattern, we rhythm our lives and our world through the relationships that define us, our families, or perhaps relationships in social media with their own codes and patterns and rhythms of behaving. On a larger scale, we've got institutions like sports clubs or schools or companies that create and sustain certain patterns of relationships. Or perhaps our relationship to authority and the state. All of these are shaped and rhythmed by norms that give meaning to our lives. And so figures in each of these categories shape our sense of ourselves and shape our sense of our world, and also express that sense and transform over time. These figures are not static, they move with culture. And critical theories work on all of these aspects of reality. They're not just clusters of ideas. And that's actually, I think, why the term theory is a little bit misleading in critical theory. And also, I think in Christian circles, it's a perennial temptation to take one category of figures and make it control all the others. So you'll read some Christian commentary and some Christian books that say things like, we are fundamentally storytelling animals, first and foremost. And everything, when you boil it down, is most fundamentally a story. Other people will say concepts are the most basic figures, and everything is at bottom a rational idea or reducible to a rational idea. Others will say that behaviors and habits are upstream of everything else. But no single category of figures controls all the others all of the time. I think to assume that it does is actually a symptom of modernity, for ways in which we could cash out in the Q&A if you're interested. So that's figures. The second word that I want to introduce is worlds. Figures allow us to move between ideas and stories and behaviors and institutions and time and space without privileging any one of them above the others. But then we come to the question, what do we call a cluster of figures that characterize a particular cultural moment or a particular cultural movement? Well, traditionally, they've been called a worldview. Is that a good term? Well, I'm happy to use it. I know a lot of people don't like it. They often cite Martin Heidegger's essay, the Age of the World Picture, in which he says that the idea of a worldview is very modern, that here I am the subject looking out at a picture of the world that's detached from me. Perhaps. I don't think it always freights that baggage with it. A term that's become more popular recently is Charles Taylor's idea of social imaginaries, because the social imaginary is broader than merely ideas. And a lot of people have latched onto this idea as a way to characterize what a cluster of figures is. Taylor describes social imaginaries in this way. He says that the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations which are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images which underlie these expectations. So it's broader than a set of ideas. And there are lots of alternatives to worldview. Each of them, I think, has its strengths, has the things that it's good at, and like tools in a toolbox, each of them comes into its own to accomplish certain tasks. But what I want to propose today is something a little simpler, I hope, and also a little more flexible. I want to call an assemblage of figures a world. And I think this term has got the great advantage of having an intuitive, everyday meaning. And it's always nice, isn't it, to use an everyday word to describe an everyday thing rather than inventing a sort of circumlocution or a Latinate or Greek sounding term to describe something that's really very ordinary. If you can use an ordinary word, it's always good to do so. So let's try and use world. So we speak, for example, of the Victorian world. We talk of my world, or the world of Star Wars, for instance, or the world of the New Testament. And what we mean in each case is a set of particular figures that rhythm space and time and ideas and reality and behavior and relationships, either in a particular sphere of life or in a particular community or in a particular artist's work. And this notion of worlds, I think, has the advantage of building bridges between, on the one hand, texts and films and visual art, and on the other hand, habits and behavior and experience. Now, there is a philosophical skeleton under this idea of worlds that you're very welcome to ask me about in Q&A if you like, but I'm going to spare you that philosophical heavy lifting unless you're particularly interested in it. So then, here's the summary of the way that I want us to try and understand critical theories. Critical theories each draw together a cluster of figures, which are patterns and rhythms of experiencing and ordering the world that make certain things visible and certain things valuable. And this cluster of figures forms a world. But what is a biblical critical theory? Well, perhaps you thought I'd never ask. Let's get down to what is really the meat of this particular talk today. Well, it begins with the recognition that the Bible too has distinctive figures. The Bible too has distinctive and repeated patterns or rhythms that become, if you like, its characteristic signature moves. So in the same way that if we know an author well, we can just read one paragraph and say, oh my goodness, that's so Ernest Hemingway. Or we can see a pantsuit in a shop window across the street and we know it immediately to be a Chanel without having to read the label. The Bible too has its recognizable signature figures. As a flavor of what I mean, here are a few examples. So first of all, in terms of language and ideas and stories, we might think of the biblical concept of covenant. It pops up again and again and again, and that rhythms the Bible's view of reality. Or think of that the first will be last motif, again, that shapes the way the Bible sees the world. In terms of time, we've got the rhythm of promise and fulfillment that structures a biblical temporality. In terms of space, we've got the really revolutionary idea in the ancient world that God is the God of all space, not like one of the localized gods of the other nations. There's one God for the whole of reality. In terms of the structure of reality, think of the biblical distinction between what's called the kingdom of this world in Revelation 11 and the kingdom of God. Or think of absolute personality theism or the creator-creature distinction. They're all ways of structuring reality biblically. In terms of behavior, think, for example, of Christians meeting together on the Lord's Day to sing and break bread and pray and hear teaching. That's a pattern of behaving. Or in terms of relationships, think of the unity of all believers in Christ, as Paul so powerfully articulates it in Galatians. Or as God as the lawgiver and the nation under him. So in all these biblical figures, these patterns and rhythms of experience and reality, we find that, if you like, the raw material for elaborating a biblical critical theory. Now, you'll notice that I'm using the terminology biblical critical theory rather than Christian critical theory. Look, it's a difference of emphasis, not a difference in kind, but I do want to bring something out through that language. The sort of critical theory that I want to develop draws its figures from a direct engagement with the Bible as far as possible. Now, a broader Christian critical theory, by contrast, might content itself to engage simply with theologians without grappling with the biblical text directly. And that's not so much what I'm trying to do. Another aspect of what I intend by calling it a biblical critical theory is that such a theory should draw its figures from the whole sweep of the Bible's storyline. And actually, it should include those non-narrative parts of the Bible as well, such as large parts of the wisdom literature. And it shouldn't unduly privilege certain moments in salvation history at the expense of certain other passages. It should, in short, adhere to the principle that Don Carson sets out in Christ and Culture Revisited, where he says, that stance is most likely to be deeply Christian, which attempts to integrate all the major biblically determined turning points in the history of redemption: creation, fall, the call of Abraham, the Exodus, the giving of the law, the rise of the monarchy, the rise of the prophets, the exile, the incarnation, the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the onset of the kingdom of God, the coming of the Spirit, and the consequent ongoing eschatological tension between the already and the not yet, the return of Christ, and the prospect of a new heaven and new earth. Now, of course, trying to do critical or social theory in that way isn't new. Over the centuries, huge strides have been made towards elaborating what I'm calling a biblical critical theory. And among all these attempts, I haven't come across any that is so brilliant or so elegantly crafted as Augustine's amazing City of God, which I'd largely take as a model for this project of a biblical critical theory. Now, Augustine's City of God, as we're aware, has two parts. In the first part, Augustine begins inside Rome's own story of reality. He scrutinizes it, he critiques the Roman culture around him, and he shows it really in a blistering analysis to be quite a small, incoherent, and self-defeating story that can't even live up to its own aspirations. And then in the second part of the book, he leads the reader out of Rome's story and into the biblical plotline from Genesis to Revelation. He demonstrates and he illustrates how life lived in the context of this true biblical story actually meets our highest aspirations, and it satisfies our deepest desires, and it makes sense of our world and of ourselves. And these two parts of Augustine's City of God working together embody what John Stott, much closer to our own day, has called double listening. And he puts it this way. Stott says, we are called as Christians to double listening, listening to both the word and the world. We listen to the word with humble reverence, anxious to understand it, and resolved to believe and obey what we've come to understand. We listen to the world with critical alertness, anxious to understand it too, and resolved not necessarily to believe and obey it, but to sympathize with it and to seek grace to discover how the gospel relates to it. And this twofold structure of listening to the word and listening to the world are the two parts of Augustine's City of God, are present in many accounts of apologetics today. So Francis Schaeffer, for example, would call the first half of Augustine's City of God taking the roof off Roman culture. Or to use Daniel Stranger's language of subversive fulfillment, that the first part of the City of God subverts the Roman world, and the second part shows how its deepest aspirations are fulfilled in the gospel. Or again, to use Tim Keller's lexicon, the first part of the City of God confronts Roman culture, and the second part completes or consoles Roman culture. Now, both parts of the City of God contain arguments, but I think it's important for us to see that these arguments are suspended, not dissolved, suspended in the solution of narrative that gives them their context. And this is also the case in the Bible, isn't it? There are plenty of arguments in the Bible, but they're suspended in the solution of a narrative that runs from Genesis to Revelation. So what? Well, what distinguishes a biblical critical theory from, I don't know, a Bible overview or a systematic theology or an exercise in apologetics is the fundamental question that it asks. And the fundamental question that it asks is, so what? When I was a young Christian, there were two popular books that were sort of passed around in the Christian circles in which I moved. One of them was called Know What You Believe, and the other one was called Know Why You Believe. And they represent well, I think, the two main emphases of the Christian culture in which I grew up. First of all, to understand what the Bible teaches, and then to be able to defend those teachings against attack. In other words, doctrine and apologetics. We know what Christian doctrine is. We know why it's well-grounded. But I wonder if we always know quite as well where that doctrine takes us, what its implications and consequences are for the world around us. Now, if it weren't so clumsy, and I'm afraid it is very clumsy, I'd like to write a third volume in that series entitled something like not Know What You Believe or Know Why You Believe, but You Believe, So What? The Trinity, so what for politics? So what for truth? Sin, so what for anthropology? So what for justice? Or grace, so what for society? So what for personal identity? Now, I've given the next section this rather runic title, How Does a Biblical Cultural Theory Move? And what I mean is, how does it typically engage with contemporary culture and politics and society? Now, I can't cover the whole of this, but I just want to pick out one move that we see again and again. And it comes from the particular cultural moment in which we live. We live at a very odd cultural moment because many of our culture's assumptions and values retain a deeply Christian imprint. But most of the Bible's teachings have been largely forgotten or misunderstood. And this makes for, at times, a strange and almost amusing situation in which our society increasingly sets itself against Christianity, but it usually does so in very distinctively Christian ways, with Christian-type arguments and Christian-type assumptions. And yet the Christianity of our culture is, if you like, a very poor photocopy of the real thing. It's streaky, it's partial, it's distorted, it's hard to make out what it's a copy of. And so often, principles that sit together very happily in harmony in the Bible, we find wrenched apart and set up as absolute opposites in the culture as opposite sides of a debate, with the result that opposing camps both actually contain fragments of biblical truth, but failed to be able to put them together, failed to grasp the biblical whole. This is, I think, summed up really nicely by G.K. Chesterton in Orthodoxy, where he says the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Some humanitarians care only for pity, and their pity, I'm sorry to say, is often untruthful. And therefore, it's not surprising that given a choice between two camps or two positions in our culture, frequently the Bible wants to say, well, neither of them. And it presents something better than both, that neither of these two partial positions is able to imagine in its own terms. And therefore, time and time again, when we bring the Bible's figures to bear on the culture and society around us, we find that it reveals both options that are offered to us to be distorted, partial, heretical versions of a bigger biblical truth. And this move of cutting across and rearranging the false cultural dichotomies in our society is one that I call diagonalization. Now, there are different variations of it, but it usually comprises some mixture of 4 different elements. It begins with a complex of interrelated biblical truths. So, for example, God is both loving and merciful. Just and loving, both merciful and truthful. And in the Bible, those are not in tension with each other. There's no sense that there's a battle between God's justice and his love, or between his mercy and his truth. Diagonalization then shows that our culture splinters this rich biblical reality and offers it to us in a fragmented form in which it's packaged as a series of mutually exclusive choices. So we either opt for a loveless justice or a justiceless love. Or sometimes it's presented to us as a very unsatisfying compromise, some sort of porridge of half love, half justice. And what diagonalization does is it draws on the complex biblical reality, and it presents us a picture in which the best aspirations of both of these warring parties are fulfilled in the biblical truth, but not in a way that either of them could have seen coming, in a way that surprises them both. Now, variations on this type of engagement have a long history in Christian thought. The paradigmatic example of this, I think, is in 1 Corinthians 1, in which Paul shows how the Greeks' love of wisdom on the one hand and the Jews' desire for powerful signs on the other hand, both actually find their fulfillment in the same foolish and weak cross of Christ, which Paul proclaims as the power and the wisdom of God. And again, Chesterton, I think, sums up the way that the Bible relates to these dichotomies really helpfully. He says, we want not an amalgam or compromise, but both things at the top of their energy, love and wrath, both burning. Now, I need not remind the reader, he says, that the idea of this combination is central in Orthodox theology. For Orthodox theology has specially insisted that Christ was not a being apart from God and man like an elf, nor yet a being half human and half not like a centaur, but both things at once, and both things thoroughly, very man and very God. And so diagonalization is not some sort of middle of the road, safe cardigan and slippers wearing compromise between the choices offered us in our society. It does something more radical, more subversive than that to the way that our culture thinks. Now, as I begin to come to a close now, I want to offer 3 reasons why elaborating a biblical theory is an important thing for us to be doing at our current cultural juncture. The first is for the intellectual health of the church. I think this sort of thinking is important because it gets the church and Christians on the front foot, so to speak. It breaks out of the mold that sometimes we can fall into of being reactive, of simply responding to the choices that our culture gives us, choosing one or the other of the dichotomized positions, conservative or progressive, left or right, and so on and so on and so on. And if we begin with the Bible's own figures, then I think it allows us to bring something genuinely fresh and deeply Christian to the table, both in our own understanding of society and culture and in the way we engage with the great public debates of our time, that we're not just giving warmed over secular views, sprinkling them with a bit of Bible dust and pretending that they're Christian, but we're drawing responses to the great questions that face us out of the Bible's own figures, and then seeking to engage the culture with those. The second reason that I think it's helpful is for apologetics. It's not primarily an exercise in apologetics. It's not primarily trying to answer the why question, but the so what question. But nevertheless, I think this idea of a biblical critical theory does have an apologetic dynamic. And it's brought out in one of Pascal's pensées, and Pascal writes, men despise religion, they hate it, and they're afraid it may be true. To cure that, we have to begin by showing them that religion is not contrary to reason, that it's worthy of veneration and should be given respect. Next, it should be made lovable. It should be make the good wish it were true, and then show that it is indeed true. So first of all, you make Christian teaching attractive. You show people that this would actually be a really good way for the world to be if it were true. And then the question arises, well, is it actually true? In a 2020 interview, Tim Keller quotes this pensée, and he adds this helpful comment. And this is transcribing an oral interview. So it's Tim Keller speaking to an interviewer on YouTube. And Keller says, there's really no reason for me to get the guns out on the evidence for the resurrection, which is trying to show that Christianity is true, if they don't want it to be true. But if I get them to want it, if they get to the place of saying, gee, wouldn't that be a great thing if Christianity was true, but is it? Then I can do my apologetics. And so the apologetic aim of biblical critical theory then is not to show that Christianity is true, although I'm convinced that it is, but it's to help bring people to the point where they might want it to be true, and to help Christians to praise God even more deeply and fervently that it is true. And finally, I think a biblical critical theory is helpful in working for the shalom of the cities in which we find ourselves. Because more often than not, as we take a deep dive into the figures of the Bible and we try and bring those into conversation with our world, we'll find that the Bible brings unexpected and constructive perspectives to bear on some of the social and cultural questions of our day, largely because our society has forgotten what the Bible actually says. And so all we need to do to be radical and fresh and innovative is just go back to the old story. And that is surprising for people today. In the City of God, Augustine doesn't merely explain the Bible to Roman culture. He explains Roman culture through the framework of the biblical story. In other words, he elaborates a biblical, social, and cultural critical theory for his own day. And at our moment in history, I would suggest, it's not enough for Christians simply to explain the Bible to our culture. We also need to explain our culture through the Bible and pray for the raising up of a new generation of thoroughly Christian critical theorists. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. What I'd like to do now is allow some questions to be brought forward. I'm going to lead with a question. Participants, I have enabled the chat feature. You can chat your questions directly into Dr. Watkin. That way he can prioritize them. I'm going to leave him pinned as a speaker. You came to hear him and no one else. And so we're going to leave him pinned as a speaker as well. I'm going to lead with one question. I'll give some others time to bring forward their questions. If you were to come into New York City, which would be wonderful, maybe we could arrange that in months to come when we're able to travel like that. And we were to gather in.
If ever that sort of thing becomes an option again, it seems a long time ago, doesn't it? International.
That's travel. Right. That's right. And we could gather in the philosophy department from NYU and Columbia and the Graduate Center together and put them in a room with you for a cup of coffee. Which aspect of the biblical story would you wish to bring forward that perhaps since the time of Augustine, the Western liberal tradition has not brought forward in a way that you wish they had? I'm thinking here of Locke, Kant, Rawls, big figures in the Western liberal tradition. What do you think has been missing from the Western liberal tradition, which is, in the United States context, I think taken for granted to be rather reflective of the biblical tradition? I think that's why we have some conflict. But I just wonder if, given that moment, which aspect of the biblical material and the events of redemptive history would you want to amplify in that conversation, and why?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, Jay. I'd want to throw the emphasis on, and this is not a way of evading your question, feel free to come back to me. I'd want to put the emphasis on the whole, the fact that it's an integrated story. So it's sort of as if you're asking which side of the square is the most important one, which one makes it the square. Well, it needs all of them. And I think what happens in a lot of non-Christian thought is that one aspect of this biblical story of creation, fall, redemption, consummation is made the control of everything else. So you will get very pessimistic views of human nature that seem in Christian language to bang on about the fall all the time and forget about redemption. Or you'll get views of reality that seem only to value the creation moment and not see the evil or the brokenness of our world. And I think what I want to say to a group of people like that, as well as listening to what they'd have to say, is that could it be that each of us, and I suppose I'm doing the elephant thing here, aren't I? Could it be that each of us is seeing a part of God's wonderful, complex reality? That each of your philosophies, dear colleagues, is perhaps, would you entertain the thought for a moment, actually taking something that's part of a larger reality and blowing it up to a bigger proportion than it actually warrants. And so I'd want to say that the Christianity only makes sense. And I think the great value and explosive nature of this biblical critical theory only comes when the whole of it is there, when creation, fall, redemption, and consummation are all speaking to each other. And you get this multifaceted view of reality. And I think that's what's missing in non-Christian philosophies, quite frankly. They're all onto something, but very, very few of them, none that I can think of, are onto everything. And so I'd want to talk about everything.
Well, that's an excellent response. Thank you for that. So I'll direct you now, and you can field questions as they've been given to you directly in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciated the diagram you had on the diagonalization, and I followed steps 1, 2, and 3. But number 4, perhaps I was still trying to jot down 1 through 3. Could you explain 4 the end result of that process?
Absolutely. So the Bible looks at the dichotomies that are offered to us in our world, and it sees that both of them, if you want to put it this way, are Christian heresies. That both take something of God's truth, make it the whole thing, and cut it off from the rest. And so the way that you'd want to engage with that is not simply to dismiss them, and neither to choose one or the other of them, but actually to rearrange them, to say both of them are inadequate, but I want to show you the bigger picture that both of these reductive choices are part of. And that's the diagonalization. So in this diagram there on the screen, we've got this idea of love that sort of butts up against truth and justice sometimes, and this idea of justice that is often cast as unloving. And let's open the Bible and look at how God's love and faithfulness seem to harmonize and resonate with each other. That there's a bigger reality in which both these things coexist, as Chesterton says, both at the height of their blazing power. It's not as if God is some sort of muddled compromise of love and justice. And therefore, you're seeing how our culture is always reducing biblical complexity, always cutting apart biblical truths that belong together. Does that help answer the question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Now, I think Tanner has a hand up. Tanner, are you there behind your cloak of blackness?
I am. Thank you so much. This was very valuable and helpful. I have several questions. I'll ask my favorite, and then if we have time, maybe I can get to the others. I was reading Truman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and he breaks down how different philosophical ideas shaped where we're at in terms of expressive individualism. And he goes through, many figures, Freud, Rousseau, etc. I couldn't help but think when you were talking about your different identities, how did you term it again? The figures. I couldn't help but think that Rousseau almost makes up one figure, Freud makes up another figure, which have all, Marx makes up another figure, and all of these have kind of formed this amalgam of what we're calling a story. Would you say I'm on the right track with that? And if so, do you think apologetically attacking individual figures is a path forward? And I don't mean their philosophical, precursor, but I mean their particular instantiation as we see it now in society.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Tanner. That's a really rich question. I would use the term figures not to describe Rousseau or Freud themselves, but that the structures that they give us for thinking about ourselves. So a Rousseauian figure, for example, would be, there is this thing called the inner authentic me that exists prior to being messed around with by society. There's a pure me that gets stuffed up when I enter into rotten old culture. And that's a way of structuring our sense of ourselves. That's the figure. And for Freud, you have a similar idea. The structure, the pattern of me is that there's this little bit of me called the conscious self, and there's the huge bit of me called the unconscious, or the id and the superego in his later thought, that gives us a way of patterning and rhythming our sense of ourselves. So those would be the figures. I'm not sure that simply attacking those does justice to a biblical view. And again, I'd want to draw on this idea that Daniel Strange has called subversive fulfillment, and others have given other terms to say, what are they trying to get at when they think of ourselves in that way? And so let's take Freud, for example. There's a sense that there's more to me than my conscious self. Is that true? Yes. And there's a sense of that there are parts of me that I'm not in control of. I do things sometimes that I wish I hadn't, or that I can't explain having done. And all of those are sort of helpful intuitions. They give us a sense. I think that the Bible would concur that we're not completely transparent to ourselves. Jeremiah on the heart, for example. And then we say, well, how would the Bible get at what Freud is trying to get at with his topography of the psyche? They say, well, it wouldn't get at it in a Freudian way. It wouldn't talk about the id and the superego. But we would talk about the heart, the deceitfulness of the heart. We talk about regeneration, blah, blah, blah. And then I think what we'd want to do is show how Freud is onto something, but doesn't quite grasp the reality of it in a biblical frame. And so in a sense, we can come along and help him and say, what I think you're trying to get at, Sigmund, is this. In this fuller picture. And I think you've got part of it, but I don't think you've got all of it. And what we're doing there is we're taking Freud through a 1 Corinthians 1 journey, if you like. So Jews demand miraculous signs, Greeks seek wisdom. Freud is looking for the reality of the psyche. And all of them can't find the fullness of what they're looking for in the terms that they're looking for it. Greek wisdom is never full-bodied fundamental wisdom. The Jews will never find the fullness of power the way they're looking for it. And Freud will never understand the full complexity of human reality outside of the creation, fall, redemption, consummation framework. And so all of these things can be subversively fulfilled by taking them through that journey. So we're neither simply attacking Freud, nor simply affirming him, nor cherry picking little bits of what he says and taking them as if we can extract them from the rest. It's a more fundamental engagement with him than that. And so that's what I'd want to do. I wouldn't want to attack Freud, neither would I want to agree with him. I'd want to take him through that 1 Corinthians 1 journey. Now, there are quite a few questions that have been written here in the comments, I think. I haven't had a chance to read them yet, so let me just read them one by one and see what I can do. Dennis writes, when you talk about critical theory making some things valuable, what will be the standard that is used to determine what is valuable? Now, it's a great question, Dennis. So from a Christian point of view, we have a standard that's outside the created order. The God of Genesis 1 says that things are good. That's not our decision. That's something that is outside our human reality. If we don't have that, we have to get our sense of what is good and bad from inside the created world somewhere. And people have done this in various ways. Some people have said, okay, let's say that reason is good and superstition is bad. Some people have said, let's say that the proletariat is the embodiment of the good and the bourgeoisie is what must be overcome. But the problem is that whenever we do that, whenever we get our measure of what is good and bad from inside the created order, then it makes us very closed cultural critics. It closes our minds, because at the pain of losing all our orientation to what is good and bad, we've got to say that some things in this world are unqualified, unmitigated good. And some things in this world are unqualified and unmitigated bad. And that opens the door, does it not, to dogmatism and totalitarianism. But the Christian doesn't find her ultimate reference for what is good in this world. And what does that mean? It means that whatever we encounter in the created order, we encounter with an expectation that it's going to be some mixture of good and bad. Now, there can be different proportions in that mixture. Some things can be better than others. Some things can be almost all bad and some things almost all good. I'm not suggesting that everything is equal. But it will mean that whatever we encounter, we'll be able to look at it with an open mind. So there's going to be something here that is of value, because the only thoroughly evil thing is the devil. And there's going to be something here that's to reject, because the only good one is God, and he is not in this world. And so it leaves the Christian with a wonderful openness, a critical, in the best sense of that term, a critical openness to the whole of culture that is very, very hard to get to if you don't have your ultimate reference for what is good and bad outside of the created order. We've got a question, do these biblical truths make sense through Christ? That's a fascinating question. I think the answer is yes, to the extent that the whole of the scripture witnesses to Christ. So when Christ says, these are the scriptures that testify about me, what's written in Moses, the prophets and the Psalms, the whole of the Bible bears witness to Christ, and therefore everything that I'm talking about is about Christ. But I want to include the whole of the biblical witness. So the whole of the Old Testament and the whole of the New Testament, not simply the passages that speak of Christ, but everything makes sense through Christ in the sense that the whole of the scripture is about him. Next question. We're finding Hollywood and Netflix becoming increasingly weaving out stories that successfully distract and detract from a biblical worldview. So while people become quite familiar with the worlds of their favorite shows, they are versed in the biblical view at any meaningful level. They're not versed in the biblical view at any meaningful level. Yeah. To ask the right questions and engage with Christians intelligently about it. How do you think we introduce cultural touch points for the lost? I think that sort of, it's a brilliant question. Thank you, Tony. I think that sort of question always is hard to answer in the abstract, because it will depend on each individual encounter. So some people will love big philosophical thoughts and we can go to town with them over a cup of coffee for a couple of hours. Other people will respond much better to a very sort of succinctly put single thought and then a bunch of illustrations about it. So I wouldn't want to say there's a one size fits all response. But one thing that you could do is start with your Netflix shows, if that's what they're interested in, It will inevitably be that those shows mirror certain parts of the biblical storyline. So you could say, why are all Hollywood films basically the same film? Why do we keep making the same film over and over and over again? That there's one central character, there's a big problem or a crisis that she or he faces, and through superhuman or unusually noteworthy exploits, our hero sort of rises and wins in the end, and it's a happy ending. Why do we like that story so much? What is it that's deep in us that resonates with that story? And you say, well, actually, funnily enough, that happens to be the Bible story. And that is the story of our universe. Now, I'm sort of drawing on Tolkien's of fairy tales here and some material from C.S. Lewis, where they're saying that all these fairy tales resonate with us because they're actually getting at something that's true about the universe, which is this creation, fall, redemption, consummation framework. And so you could start with Netflix itself, and then rather seeing it simply as a block to engaging with the gospel, you could see it as a stepping stone. Why do you like it? Tell me about a series you like. Why do you like it? What draws you? Why do you keep going back to that series? Why do you keep watching it? And also that sort of engagement helps the person that we're talking with to become self-reflective. So I think that's something that's really missing in our society today. There's hardly any time for us to think about why we think what we think or why we feel what we feel. Because if there's any spare moment, it's sucked up looking at Twitter on our phone or something like that. And so just getting people to think, why do you like that series? Tell me about what it does for you, can actually be a really helpful moment in which people can, perhaps in a way that they haven't for a long time, think about their own views. My goodness, I have a view of the world. Didn't think that. I thought that I just believed what was common sense, and other weird people out there had a view of the world. So getting people to recognize that they have a position, and that position also might have its tensions and its difficulties, as well as its attractiveness, is a really helpful moment in that sort of engagement. Next question. When you talk about this theory being helpful in apologetics to get people to want it to be true, how does this work in the light of the biblical teaching of the sinfulness of man? That's a really good question, Dennis. And I think it again goes back to this idea of we want to take into account the whole of biblical reality. And so if we were simply thinking of people as mistaken and needing education, which is a Rousseauian view of humanity, we would say, present the truth to them, they will then want it to be true, and then we can go on and explain the gospel. But of course, as Dennis is very helpfully putting, and as all of us will have experienced, people don't do that. There's a stubbornness, there's a resistance, even to things that we think are perfectly clear. And of course, that is the doctrine of sin that's also in our own hearts. And having this full-orbed biblical view of creation, fall, redemption, consummation can stop us being surprised when that happens. But it also stops us simply disengaging because that happens, because we know that people are not fundamentally and exclusively defined by this suppression of the truth in wickedness, as Romans 1 would have it. There's more to people than that. And so we can press on trying different ways of helping people to understand, different prayers that we can pray for people to understand, despite this resistance, in a way that tries to bring the whole of the biblical storyline to bear on the way that we engage with people. I think the next question is David's here. It seems to me that a certain stream of critical theory, the increasingly influential stream of post-structuralism around people like Derrida and Foucault, like Leclerc, Lacan, and maybe also Butler, completely dismisses metaphysical references of all kinds of essentialisms. What point in post-structuralism would you use to attach biblical critical theory and enter the conversation? That's another great question. I think it really depends on your individual thinker, because we group these people together, don't we? And there's a sense in doing that. There are certain things that they have in common, but they're actually really, really different to each other. Derrida and Foucault, for example, had a big bust-up. They did not agree fundamentally with each other. And so the first thing that I'd want to do is try and give each of them the dignity and respect of engaging with them on their own terms, rather than lumping them together and saying that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all way of engaging. I've done this in a few books that I've written. So with Derrida, I took John chapter 1, and I said there can be a really interesting conversation between the Johannine prologue and Derrida's account of reality. And as you step through the prologue, looking at the Logos and then looking at the way that Derrida thinks of Logos, comparing the two, you can begin to build bridges between the two, not in the sense that they're agreeing with each other, but that there are common themes that they are talking about that you can then explore from a biblical point of view. I think in Foucault, it works very differently. So the middle Foucault, for example, is all about power. Of course, power is something that the Bible has a huge amount to say about. So if we think, for example, of Philippians 2, where Christ, who is in the very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself a servant and so forth. And then God exalts him to the highest place. That's a very distinctive biblical figure of power, that the powerful empties himself and then is exalted by another. It's a story of power, of setting power aside and then receiving it again in glory. And that picture of power from that passage and from other passages in the Bible can be brought into conversation with Foucault's idea of power. And when we do that, I think what we find is that the Bible has a subtler and more subversive account of power than Foucault does. Both of them are sort of critiquing the very linear Roman emperor type of power, where power simply shows itself in the size of its army and in the influence that it can exert over other people. But I think the Bible has a deeper and richer critique of that than Foucault is able to achieve with his own resources. And for all of the thinkers you mentioned there, David, I think there'd be a different way of engaging with them. So you want to look very carefully at what the thinker in that particular thinker is saying, and then take a step back and think, well, what in the whole cornucopia of biblical figures would most help us to start a conversation between the Bible and ethic? And the final question that we've got down here is from Tanner. Are the 5 or 6 categories of figures you used exhaustive? As we seek to engage the culture, I think it's important that we leave no figure unconfronted. If they're not exhaustive, are there other figures you would add off the top of your head? I do stick to the list, but I don't die on that hill, I think would be my answer to that, Tanner. So I've tried to create categories that are broad enough and vague enough that pretty much anything can fit in one of them. And that's what taxonomy does, isn't it? It's ways of organizing ideas that aren't necessarily the only way that this could have been done. That's like putting books on a bookshelf. You've got to have some sort of system. There might have been another system that sort of works fine, but you've got to choose one. And that's what I've done with these categories. I think they probably include pretty much anything you might want to have. I'm not saying it's the only way I could possibly have done it, and other people could do it other ways, and I'm sure that'd be fine. But this is a way of getting to grips with, of getting a handle on the different sorts of figures that exist.
Well, Dr. Watkin, you've been very generous with your time with us, and we appreciate it. Appreciate you spending this time with us. I do hope that in the future, as I say, it seems like an imaginary world, but it's a possibility that we continue to hope for. We could arrange for you to visit RTS New York City. Thank you for our participants for your patience as we got going today. And I will submit the copy of this video to Chris, and if he wishes to post it on his website, he may do that. It is his material, and so we're happy to have him do that. So I would like to invite you all to come back. We have another one of these sessions coming. April 14th, Dr. Drew Johnson, who is at the King's College here in New York City, will be giving a talk on a book that he has coming out, How the Bible Does Philosophy. And so that should be very interesting as well. Thanks again. Thank you again, Dr. Watkin, and everybody have a good evening.
Just let me add my thanks. Wonderful questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging. Thank you, Jay, for organizing it. I had an absolute ball. It was a great pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.